In January 2024, Willem Dafoe entered the Criterion Closet, where artists are invited to steal and talk about whatever Criterion restored films catch their eye. Dafoe's first choice, prolific Japanese filmmaker Kaneto Shindo's
Onibaba,
which Dafoe explains he once acquired the rights for in the hopes of producing a remake, but found any spin he attempted to put on the story was unable to do it justice because it is so specific to its time. Cited by William Friedkin as one of the most frightening films he'd ever seen, and the Hanya mask inspiring the demonic makeup in his most influential film, The Exorcist, Onibaba sits just outside the top ranks of what you might describe as your favourite filmmaker's favourite films, otherwise known as Sight and Sound's greatest films of all time poll. However, what has on numerous occasions made it onto this poll, and debuted in what still stands as its highest ever position of number 5, is Kenji Mizoguchi's Ugetsu, a director Shindo considered his mentor, and a film that interlaces the harshness of war with the supernatural and resonates a tragic story of greed, ambition, regret, and the cruel forces of history, themes Shindo's Onibaba would, 11 years later, explore at their most visceral. The accuracy of Onibaba's categorization as a horror isn't as straightforward as most of the media that makes up the genre. Unlike the kaiju monster films Japanese horror has been most famous for since the original Godzilla, Onibaba was among the first to innovate a certain style of slow progression of unsettling atmospheres that has since inspired J-horrors like Audition or Ring, and the recent A24 popularized brand known as elevated horror, like Robert Eggers' The Witch and The Lighthouse. Set during a 14th century civil war, the absence of dialogue during Onibaba's opening minutes focuses our attention on how the two main female characters are surviving in a seemingly endless land of reeds. The small cast of characters who spend all film traversing the same environment aren't in heaven, hell, or limbo, but surviving the indirect consequences of humanity at its worst, war, encountering our most primal fears and the supernatural consequences of acting on their most primal desires and needs. Heights, isolation, darkness, predators, violence, but for the women the most immediate primal fear they open the film with suffering from is hunger, which they have found themselves able to satiate by killing samurai trapped amongst the maze of reeds, stripping them of their belongings to sell to a local merchant, and dumping the evidence into a mysterious black hole. These opportunistic women are the mother and wife of a man who left to fight in the war, and it is when their sleazy neighbour Hachi returns from the war with news this man he was fighting alongside has died, the younger woman happily gives in to his lustful advances, and the older woman becomes jealous of being overlooked for her age, that tensions between them quickly rise. To portray this lust, the film is surprisingly explicit for the time, at which point the US was still 4 years away from the removal of the Hays Code guidelines. Still, Onibaba's open sexuality was quite controversial by Japanese standards, included to such an extent only because Shindo staked the future of his career on this relatively small budget, independent production, but all the whilst doing so without becoming gratuitous. Hachi and the daughter not making love, but driven wild by an animalistic need to ravage each other every night. The interesting thing is that this shamefully marriageless relationship the daughter gives into partaking in with Hachi, immediately abandoning the hope her husband didn't die, the film doesn't portray it as evil or wrong. On the contrary, it brings them enormous, if only superficial joy, as a respite from the miserable struggle to survive that makes up the rest of their war-torn lives. The mother's jealousy also has a depth to it, conservative oppression and contempt for the daughter's quick discardment of her husband, and how she is still blessed with the youthful privilege to find a desirable mate. The hypocrisy to deny an offer from the merchant to who she is closer in age, and then trying but failing to seduce Hachi herself, On top of the fear she'll be abandoned and unable to kill the samurai whose belongings have been keeping them alive. All of this resulting in her going to increasingly great efforts to keep them apart by scaring her daughter with tales of demons and the punishments of hell. It's an extremely personal, emotional deceit that neither woman directly confronts one another with until the film's very end. Onibaba, translating to Demon Hag or Devil Woman, and in English retitled to The Hole, is a retelling of, or is at least inspired by, a Shin Buddhist parable performed in No theatre called Bride Scaring Mask, or Mask with Flesh Attached, about a woman donning a Hanya mask to scare her daughter-in-law away from a temple, the daughter's routine visits to which the mother felt was becoming an obstacle to their family business. The Hanya mask itself represents the soul of human women who have fallen prey to obsessive jealousy or been betrayed and lost their sanity at the hands of despicable men. The folklore legends state that women will become the vengeful Hanya demon if they die while consumed with immense levels of rage, jealousy, and emotional distress in their hearts. The way one of these Hanya masks is presented to the mother in Onibaba, her verbal manipulations having failed to scare the daughter away from Hachi, is as though the universe is testing what level of betrayal she is willing to act on her envy. A samurai barging into her hut and refusing to remove his mask, such that a more predictable story would reveal him to be the son returning home alive and well to fight the man with whom his wife has been unfaithful. Instead, in seeking a guide out of the reed field, the stranger takes the mother hostage, and she tricks him into falling down the black hole. Whilst Hachi and the daughter run naked and laughing through the fields, the mother works to climb down the hole to retrieve the samurai's belongings and see whether the face he was hiding under the mask is really as handsome as he boasted. Her physical descent as much a parallel to her moral descent as the swaying reeds are a parallel to each character's feelings, entering the eternal terminus at the root of our most primal fears, death, from which she will not return the same. The mask she has to struggle to tear free from the samurai's face, worn long enough from wherever he acquired it to have in some sinister way fused with his soul, or perhaps just the result of a skin deformity or injury. Regardless, she doesn't hesitate to plot her own use of the mask to bring her tales of the demonic to life. The false consequences of adultery finally scaring her daughter-in-law from her nightly visits to Hachi's hut. Quite literally, as the bitter old woman schemes thrice over, or as many times as it would take Hachi to desperately give in to her advances instead, to intercept her daughter's hopeful lust with a display these 14th century peasants would know no better than to believe to be supernatural. Until to the disappointing surrender with which she acts in my favourite moment of the film, on the third night her disguise fails to keep the eruptive passion between Hachi and the daughter from clashing during the pathetic fallacy of a rainstorm. Hachi has rejected the prospect of mating with her, and the daughter has rejected her attempts to wield the oppressions of conservative and supernatural guilt. Whether giving up on her deceit naturally or driven to do so by the mask latching onto her face, the mother returns to their hut to ask her daughter to help remove it. Only the punishment for her sin isn't as simple as being stuck with the mask, as they have as much trouble removing it as she did from the face of the dead samurai, and the daughter resorts to the vengeful violence of beating the mask with a mallet until it splits in the center, blood trickles down the mother's face, and its separation from her skin reveals the state of horrific disfigurement she has been left with. Having nowhere to run to after Hachi was killed by a fellow deserter stealing from his hut, the daughter flees in fear of a face more frightening than any demonic mask, a face that to her may be evidence of the punishments awaiting those who sin. Mixed with the euphoria of being freed from the mask and pleading to still be recognized as a human, the mother runs after her until the film cuts to its abrupt end on the ambiguity of whether she also makes the leap over the hole, ambiguity that symbolizes symbolizes humanity's constant dance around death, and the woman's face blurring what little was left of the line between demon and human, as the victims of war may find to be their fate down the path of dehumanization their survival forces them to contend with.
恐ろしや。天持ちもひっくり返ったんじゃのう。
Clearly, Shindo has added a lot of his own ideas on top of this Shin Buddhist parable, transforming it from a story about balancing religion with profession to an existential nightmare about humanity's inescapable primal instincts. Another respected Japanese film from 1964 diverges even further from mainstream audiences' modern concept of what makes something a horror, Woman in the Dunes, directed by Hiroshi Teshigahara, written by Kobo Abe, adapted from his book of the same name, and currently sitting at number 29 on the Letterboxd Top Narrative Features list. An entomologist visits a secluded desert outside of Tokyo to collect specific insects he aspires to study for his career, only he stays out late enough to miss the last bus home and resorts to accepting the accommodation some locals offer him. This accommodation takes him to the bottom of an interesting little sand dune where a widow lives alone in a rickety but cozy old house and works through the night shoveling loose sand into buckets to be hoisted to the men above. She says it's okay for the visitor to rest without helping her shovel for the first night, but he only intends to stay for this one night. Understandably unsettled, the man counts the seconds until dawn and, with the woman sleeping naked under a shower of sand, quietly dresses and makes his departure, only to find the ladder he had entered the dune with gone and the walls of sand unclimbable by hand.
悪いけど、はしごを出してもらえないかな。はしごがなくなってるんだよ。
He takes the woman hostage so the villagers release him, but they cruelly tempt him with release, only to leave him and the woman without water until they resume work. Successfully shoveling the sand was too much for the woman alone, and as far as she believes, this work is necessary not only to prevent her house from being submerged or collapsed in a sandstorm, but to protect the community. From the perspective of us and the man, however, there seems to be little sinister or apocalyptic origin behind this sand, and the villagers are merely using slaves as the cheapest way to harvest the sand to sell to the city factories. He refuses to work and prevents the woman from working for a little while until he gives in to drinking some alcohol the villagers had maliciously provided, immediately goes into an existential crisis about the inevitable collapse of civilization, tries to tear the house apart to build a ladder, and then gets intimate with the woman when she tries to stop him, which scary violin noises screech over the top of. This may not be as overtly erotic or psychologically thrilling as Onibaba, which itself barely meets those definitions by today's standards, but it unfolds or burns even more slowly. It takes more than 30 minutes before the man realizes he is trapped, another 30 minutes before the combination of alcohol and isolation triggers his crisis and he begins working with the woman, and then another 30 minutes until he attempts to make the escape he was pretending not to be planning. Despite climbing out of the dune, he fails to find freedom in the darkness of the desert landscape, seemingly the whole village in on this little illegal operation. The rest of the film, in which months pass of him and the woman toiling away, portrays his slow resignation to their pitiful situation, trapped with maintaining the endless progress of a giant hourglass from its unfavourable lower half. Like Onibaba, it derives its horror from a pervasive atmosphere of dread that builds until it explodes. However, whereas Onibaba occasionally shows its age in stylistically missing the mark on what should be some of its more horrific moments, most notably the mother's descent down the hole of death, which isn't played nearly dramatically enough for something so thematically central, Woman in the Dunes, besides the sequence in which the man runs through the desert in attempt to escape, never lives up to the psychologically disturbing potential of its setup. The film, much like the concept of entrapment itself, risks succumbing to repetition. The heavy-handed contrast between rich city life and poor rural isolation, and the endless exploitation of the working class to fuel the lives of the rich, while the film's most famous narrative element is worn so openly and explained so plainly in dialogue that it dilutes the nuance and indeed the horror of the story, the allegory of which isn't, on its own, as profound as it seems to think it is. I have the same issue with The Face of Another, released 2 years later by the same director and writer, about a man facially disfigured in an industrial accident being given a mask of the face of a non-existent person, and full of nothing but pretentious exposition on the masks people use to obscure their true identities. For all of its effectively unnerving close-ups of human skin, rippling sand, water droplets and insects, and the creativity behind the claustrophobic framings and precise blockings within this small space, the only interesting depth to the horror I can find in the civilizational allegory Women in the Dunes becomes too straightforward in its deliverance of comes from comparing it to Onibaba's themes on human nature. Both environments are sensual but also invasive and oppressive. They are beautiful but unrelenting, always shifting. They respond to the character's presence, but they also swallow up and erase them. Both environments contain existential dread. They existed before the characters got there and will exist after they have disappeared. Both environments seem endless. We never see anything off in the distance, just more sand or more reeds. This gives both films a kind of cosmic universality, as if they represent the entire world. Similar to how Hachi and the daughter partake in a primitive love to bring each other some fleeting happiness, the man and woman in Woman in the Dunes find themselves reliant on each other's differences, but with whatever genuine love they manage to find in the relationship still dirtied by the ever-shifting, inescapable discomfort of the sand. Forever aware that he is only living according to the whims of this environment, when the woman falls pregnant, the villagers take her in for medical care and leave behind another chance for the man to escape. He nonetheless decides to stay to continue the little water collecting project he had secretly been working on, hoping whatever technological benefits he discovers it to bring to this Sisyphean lifestyle can be passed down to improve the lives of his children. Now that he's grown accustomed to the cycle, found a pet project, and invested in a family, the thought of rebelling or escaping to a no doubt similar life in Tokyo seems comparatively fruitless or scary.
別に慌てて逃げ出したりする必要はないのだ。
After earning critical acclaim with an over 9-hour anti-war film, The Human Condition, and then a magnum opus of an anti-samurai film, Harakiri, director Masaki Kobayashi decided it was time for a 3-hour experimental horror anthology based on Japanese folk tales, more specifically ghost stories, called Kwaidan. If anyone thinks Onibaba is difficult to remake, or Women in the Dunes stretches what constitutes a horror to its limits, then Kwaidan is on a whole nother level. Not that I'd expect any kids to be able to make it through just how slow these rather long short films are, nor recognise or understand the vague themes they spread so thinly, but the first story is an accurate introduction to how Kwaidan comes across as a series of campfire stories, not intending to outright scare or thrill the audience, but to instill an unease about Japanese culture's close connection to the spiritual realm, albeit the end of this first story is the closest Kwaidan gets to delivering an outright scare. Titled The Black Hair, this tale follows a samurai who divorces his wife in the hopes that marrying someone of a higher status will better help him climb the social ladder of the province he is moving to for work. He succeeds in this, but finds himself unable to love his unaffectionate new wife. Thinking back on the genuine love he regrets having left behind. When many years later freed from his job, he travels back to rejoin his old wife and finds her in a corner of the same empty house, as fair and young as in his fondest memories. They happily share a bed that night, but when the samurai wakes up in the morning, he turns over to see, in place of his ex-wife, a skeleton draped in her black hair. A jump scare that in Kwaidan's silliest attempt at horror proceeds to chase him all across the house, stumbling over its increasingly dilapidated remains as he himself withers away with age. The silliness of the hair notwithstanding, it is an effectively nightmarish sequence, concluding a warning on being grateful for what you have before it's gone, and twisting the cinematography and sound design into surreal experimentation. The sound is really the shining star of creating an unsettling atmosphere to rival those of Onibaba and Woman in the Dunes, composer Toru Takamitsu having also worked on the latter, despite the 6 months he and Kobayashi reportedly took to complete the sound for Kwaidan. The second tale, The Woman in the Snow, was also later made into a feature-length film, The Snow Woman, in 1968. The standout characteristics of the short version in Kwaidan are its theatrically expressionistic painted backdrops and vibrant colour palette. Taking such inspiration from Japan's kabuki theatre by setting the majority of Kwaidan's runtime on enormous sound stages risks undermining the immersion so integral to being frightened by horror stories. However, the atmospheric density of the artificiality and how Kwaidan doesn't shy away from laying bare the craftsmanship of the artists behind it is kind of the point, if only to accentuate that these characters step too far into an unreal spiritual world and that these are, after all, stories of fiction. Still, Woman in the Snow is both the most narratively and stylistically cohesive of Kwaidan's tales, starting off with 2 woodcutters taking shelter from a snowstorm. A pale woman glides into the shelter and kills the eldest of the 2 men, but spares the youngest under the condition he never tells anyone what he has witnessed. Later, as though to test the young man on this promise, she finds his home and gives him a happy family. But at the tale's end, wondering whether the night on which he made that promise was merely a dream, he tells her, his wife, what he witnessed.
夢ではない。
Her demeanour changes back to that of the woman in the snow, and to his horror she reveals it was her all along. But for the sake of their children, she doesn't kill the man, but abandons them. Despite somewhat of an anticlimax, this is more consistently suspenseful than the black hair and less thematically thin, a moral statement of keep your promises, either contextualized by the extent to which spirits may exercise their cruelty, or alternatively, that spirits are more human than you might think, but must play by different rules, the Snow Woman having real love for the man, but forced to enact a toll on him for breaking their spiritual contract. The third tale, Hoichi the Earless, is by far the longest at 75 minutes, and it in no way justifies that length, and is in fact diminished by it. There are 4 worthwhile scenes. The opening battle, Hoichi reciting a song about the battle in literal blind ignorance for a spiritual audience of those who died, Hoichi being painted from head to toe with holy calligraphy to protect him from the spirits, and then one of the spirits ripping the ears the monks somehow forgot to write this protection on from his head. To say this is repetitive, slow, and thoroughly unthrilling is a severe understatement, certainly not living up to the absolutely metal poster of Hoichi's face covered in calligraphy that accompanies the film on Letterboxd.
今回般若心経はくまなく書いてあるな。はい。くまなく書いたつもりで。両耳だけ経文を書き忘れたと見える。
In his essay on Kwaidan, film critic Jeffrey O'Brien interprets that in Hoichi the Earless, the realm of the supernatural becomes an extension of those inescapable hierarchies and historic injustices that Kobayashi had charted in his earlier films, and to which he would return. Similarly, I agree with the conclusion lowercase j comes to at the end of his video about Kobayashi, that his films critique the control governments and ideals can have over people, told from the perspectives of those forced to oppress and be oppressed in systems they will face punishment trying to escape. Although I think this overarching theme, with which Kwaidan can be connected to Onibaba and Woman in the Dunes, doesn't come across as strongly as in The Human Condition and Harakiri. The long lengths to which these folk tales are stretched, and the exhibition of filmmaking techniques which 60 years later are difficult to immerse oneself in the admiration of, contributes to Kwaidan illustrating the problems of varied quality, lack of substance, and indigestible narrative and tonal rhythms that usually befall anthologies, feeling incomplete as small puzzle pieces that only vaguely slot together. Kwaidan's fourth, final, and shortest tale is on the surface the most tacked on in this regard, and the hardest to decipher the meaning of, but no less complementary to this anthology than the others. Titled In a Cup of Tea, it is about a guy reading an old tale in which a samurai can't escape a face that keeps appearing in the cups of tea he pours. Until he finally drinks some of the tea and henceforth finds himself haunted by whatever this jokester spirit is. He goes crazy, running around trying to fight them and stuff, but the old tale doesn't reach an ending. The guy reading it imagines several possible endings to a story about a man who swallows another's soul, a concept which I guess is meant to be scary in and of itself, and the ending we as the watchers of Kwaidan are abruptly presented with is this man investigating a tub of water in which he is scared away by another creepy face staring back at him. And so it seems the unfinished tale about spirits appearing in or haunting specific bodies of drinkable water was true after all. Lafcadio Hearn, the writer whose tales Kwaidan is sourcing from that helped introduce Japanese culture and literature to the West, had this to say about In a Cup of Tea. Have you ever attempted to mount some old tower stairway, spiraling up through darkness, and in the heart of that darkness found yourself at the cobwebbed edge of nothing? Or have you followed some coast path, cut along the face of a cliff, only to discover yourself at a turn on the jagged verge of a break? The emotional worth of such an experience, from a literary point of view, is proved by the force of sensations aroused and by the vividness with which they are remembered. Now there have been curiously preserved in old Japanese storybooks certain fragments of fiction that produce an almost similar emotional experience. Perhaps the writer was lazy, perhaps he had a quarrel with the publisher, perhaps he was suddenly called away from his little table and never came back, perhaps death stopped the writing brush in the very middle of a sentence, but no mortal man can ever tell us exactly why these things were left unfinished. So, in an almost tongue-in-cheek meta-reversal of It Was All a Dream, Kobayashi finds a suitable supernatural horror ending for Kwaidan, a gimmick of ambiguity meant to arouse fear in our imagination of the unknown and bring attention to the importance of preserving and retelling old stories and their lessons, lest those in the future repeat the mistakes and face the common dangers of an unfinished tale like In a Cup of Tea.